Let's get close, but not so close. Quarantine. You can share from a distance. Quarantine. You know we want to see each other. You'll have to stay in your quarantine space while we talk.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the first Quarantime Capsule. Today, we go back 8 weeks and take a look at how Quarantime looked at institutional imbalances in governance, in technology, and in healthcare. Some of the threads that can be connected across episodes and what they might tell us about the themes of this pandemic and where we're headed. It's our first Quarantime Capsule. Now, I return you to our hosts to explain how this all will unfold. Oh my God, Mickey, that was trippy.
That was perfect.
On the other hand, it has been a trippy 12 weeks or so.
It felt like every day. Let's bring in Jocelyn.
Yes. On today's show, everybody meet Jocelyn Yu. Jocelyn
Hi,
is our
everyone.
intern. Hi there. And for today's show, we asked Jocelyn to go back and take a look at what was meaningful to her and to her generation from what we've talked about, and tell us what you've put together for us today and how you did, and also where are you in school, Jocelyn? Introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jocelyn. Currently, I'm in Vancouver, Canada, and right now I go to the University of British Columbia. I actually just came back from Singapore from a year abroad at the National University of Singapore. So I feel like it's really cool because I got to see the world before COVID. And now I'm back working for this amazing show. So basically, I've been working on the blogs and the audio editing for the past month or so for the show. And through that, I kind of had a closer look about all the content that we're pulling out for this show. And I feel like the way that I see it is a lot from the lens of my generation, right? I see all these innovation topics that can potentially influence our leadership and our work for our communities in the future. So we had Sophia Noble and Sylvester Monroe talking about all the systematic racism and racial inequality in not only America, but the world. I feel like that's really relevant to our generation today because we care deeply about that and how to challenge that in the future. We also had Michael Floyd and Justin Leon talking about, urban prototyping and opportunity zone development and how, the space that we live in can shape our community's future and how that can help us to reshape our thinking about space. And also, I think another really relevant topic for my generation right now is health and wellness. A lot of the people around me are feeling lonely, stressed out, and even unproductive during a time like this. So I feel like a lot of our speakers like Tian Jiang or Stephen, Ellen, and even Itai, they all talked about topics that can help us determine our mind and meaning, and how the outdoor space and urban development and technology can, in a way, shape how we think about our conscious design and our mind and meaning and health and wellness.
What's excellent is I liked how you ended it. You pulled in, at the very end, you pulled in the last episode that we had just before the 4th of July, the July 3rd episode. Right. And there was this kind of topic, sort of the conversation then was, okay, those were a whole bunch of institutions from healthcare to real estate to technology. What about our democratic institution itself? What about the truths that we hold to be true? What do we want from a democratic society? And I like that. Tell me a little bit about what your generation is thinking about that side of things. How do we think about universal suffrage, or how do we think about that from your standpoint? What are you challenged with?
I think right now the problem with my generation is we have to stop thinking that it's the next generation who's going to do the work or doing the job. It's us, it's right now, like we are in the future now, right?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of things that we really care deeply about, like, you know, how can we have economic development while protecting our environment? Or how can we like further enhance racial equality? Like these are the things that we want to figure out and actually find solutions for, and how can we help our next generation in the future to still live in a healthy environment and to live in a more just society.
It's a big deal, yeah. And I think your point is, you are the generation you've been waiting for. You are them, because we might have screwed it up a little bit, but you know, the best we can be is good ancestors. But you be good ancestors for the next generation. You have a lot of things you have to handle, and hopefully we can learn from the past, but not repeat it. You know, like try to build on what we've learned. Excellent.
Exactly.
So, Peter, any last questions, thoughts? Oh, tell me a little, Jocelyn, what was it like being put on the spot with this crazy live stream and actually having to pull together an episode?
I was telling everyone earlier, I really just gotten like the hugest adrenaline rush ever. Like I was like, I did 14 hours of, you know, footage in a day. Like this is such a challenge, but I feel like this internship has trained me to love challenges, right? Like when I see something that's like so close to the deadline, I'm not scared. I'm like, I'm excited. That means, you know, my team believe in me. So I was really, really empowered.
Excellent.
Super excited.
And we call this thing, you know, we called it a Quarantime capsule because that's a cute name. But in fact, because we're up to 30 episodes and we've connected across, because you think, as we've just discussed, how much history has transpired since the middle of March, how much has gone on in how we're looking at ourselves in terms of justice, fragility of institutions, science and healthcare, right? So when you cut across that, really interesting trends start to emerge, and we're kind of interested in using Quarantime as a little bit of a first draft of trying to get where people were thinking then. So thanks. And very interesting to have it processed. First of all, thank you for the 14 hours and the perspective. Okay.
I'm sure it was more than 14 hours. It was just 14 hours of footage that you had to go through. No, I know you have not slept. We're just going to hold on to you for another hour and a half or so. I'd love you to come back at the end of this, and maybe we'll talk a little bit after we watch the Supercut, which will probably go till about 5:20, 5:30, I'd say 5:28 or so, Quarantine. We'll come back, and it'd be nice to actually reflect on how we might get the next generation more involved in Quarantine. How, you know, what might be some topics and some people, some guests we should have on to engage with. So we'll come back. I think it's time to run the Supercut, brought to us by Jocelyn.
Thank you.
We're looking forward to it.
And welcome to Quarantine. It's episode 26, our 23rd, 24th. This is the 25th episode of Quarantine.
I really came to this line of work and research when I was kind of, I guess, thinking about leaving advertising and going back to graduate school. I'd spent a 15-year career in marketing and advertising in corporate America. I'd worked on a lot of blue chip brands. And at the time that I was leaving the industry, there was, just this nascent new idea about search engine optimization, for example, to make our clients more visible on the first page of search engines, because search engines were being viewed by the public as this kind of neutral arbiter of information and products and services. And the prevailing belief was that if you could show up on the first page of a search engine, the public would trust that you were there for a reason. And so as I was going back to graduate school, I was thinking about this, and it was at a time when Google was as kind of the major player in the search engine scene. And universities were entering these partnerships all over the world, at least all over the English-speaking world, with Google, and digitizing books Huge academic library holdings were being turned over to Google to digitize because these agreements about what Google might be able to do in making all the world's knowledge available or accessible was taking hold. Of course, I recognize this as marketing discourse, and I thought it was fascinating that these public institutions and private universities all over were handing over these assets to be digitized by Google as if they were of no value to the public. And so this kind of opened up my curiosities. And I eventually conducted a study by kind of looking at how Google represents various kinds of communities and identities and people who are vulnerable, children, people of color, women, in our kind of US context. And what I found through the years of research that I did on this book was that people who were vulnerable, people who were marginalized, people who were in numerical minorities in our population, and people who did not have a lot of capital to buy their way to the top as advertisers in an advertising platform, which is what a search engine is.
When you, 10 years ago, when you started sharing some of your research, and you've been doing this for a very long time, probably longer than 10 years. I apologize for that. I don't know the timing, but a decade ago, when you started sharing this, what did you hear from people, from the academics, from the tech companies, from other things? How do they react to this? You were saying math was racist, or algorithms are racist?
There were a lot of different kinds of ideas 10 years ago. So first of all, 10 years ago, the prevailing logic was that computer code is math, and math cannot discriminate, period. Now, 10 years later, quite frankly, I will tell you, a lot of women, scholars and journalists, people of color, LGBTQ, again, people who already have and occupy marginalized identities, after 10 years of taking a lot of body blows, quite frankly, as we went to conferences, as we tried to get journalists or others, mainstream outlets to reconsider the implications of how programming happens, the values that are laden in code, the kinds of decisions that are made, the power dimensions of these platforms. One of our other, your other guests today, Kathy O'Neill, of course, being a very important voice in that. We took a lot of hits in the early days where people just wouldn't believe. And they were so enamored with the platforms that it was impossible to imagine. They just pushed it back on the public and said, well, you're searching wrong. Or maybe, I've actually had people say to me, well, maybe Black girls just do more porn. And I think, 9-year-old girls do more porn? I mean, are you serious? I mean, how can these illogical arguments be made? Fast forward 10 years, now we see these same logics that were implicated in the kind of research I was doing a decade ago are the same kinds of logics that have fomented what some people characterize as the culture wars, what we might talk about as deepening political strife between the right and the left around the world, not just the United States. Those same logics are at play now as we look at their threats to democracy, or the spread of disinformation, or the calls for genocide in different parts of the world against ethnic and religious minorities. The way in which content we have now scholars like my colleague Sarah Roberts at UCLA talking about and making mainstream that there's armies of people who moderate content, and that none of these platforms are neutral, and they're not just math. They're deeply implicated in the politics of our society.
It is interesting, in the last year, Stanford and others stood up these human-centered AI initiatives and things like that. What's your reaction to that? I mean, what's your reaction to seeing 10 years ago, they were like, well, look, math can discriminate. And Stanford and other groups obviously are the sort of birthplaces of places like Google and Facebook and others. What's your reaction to them suddenly, coming to Jesus and actually believing something? What do you think about that?
Well, again, I think that there have been a number of feminists and critical race theorists and political economists and people who did the hard work of mainstreaming the idea that these platforms are deeply political, and there are serious consequences, and the distribution of those consequences are not even, and they're not fair, and they typically harm vulnerable communities more than others who can insulate and protect themselves from these platforms and their effects, or these algorithms, artificial intelligence. I mean, we can really nuance this. I think that it's interesting that the places who were the former epicenters and maybe still current epicenters of the techno-utopian ideas that technology is going to solve all of our attendant problems, are now in charge of ethics after the rest of us, again, made visible the deeply unethical, immoral, unjust ways in which many of these technologies work in our societies. So, I find that now these places tend to be recipients of huge donations in the hundreds of millions of dollars to do some of the ethics washing work of perfecting algorithms. Because again, there's still this idea that if you can tweak or unbias the algorithm, that problems are solved. And I would argue that it's actually not a technical solution, that these are social problems that are encoded and reinscribed over and over and over into data sets that train machine learning, into assumptions that are made to plan for and predict certain types of outcomes. And this means you cannot divorce these kinds of critiques that many of us have levied. And typically people who are at those places are not making those kinds of critiques. So for me, I can tell you that, trying to bring about a center for critical internet inquiry at a place like UCLA is, we don't have people ready to hand us hundreds of millions of dollars to do the work of saying, what would it be like to pause and say, maybe some of these technologies should not be made. Maybe they should be regulated in various ways. Maybe there should be some restoration or reparation that must be made for the severe harms that have been meted out through by various companies and through various different types of technologies. Maybe some of these things should be walked back, made illegal. There's all kinds of ways that we could explore. Maybe we should take a slower approach before bringing all these things online. We have a fraction of our budgets come from public taxpayer funding. And part of the reason is because, quite frankly, corporations don't pay taxes. They certainly don't pay their fair share. And so you think about Silicon Valley being the epicenter. I mean, one of Silicon Valley and agriculture being the two most potent, powerful industries in the state of California. And you have one industry that's heavily subsidized by the public, agriculture, and you have another industry, technology, that basically uses the public infrastructure. They hire people from the top universities around the country, including from the UC system. They use our airports, our roads, our postal system, Amazon, all the public goods and public resources, but they don't pay back into it. And so what that means is, and one of the reasons why you see something like that initiative you brought up at Stanford, is that then tech companies in this sector can cherry pick the researchers and the places that they want to invest their resources. And so that means that the research, and one of the reasons why my research is less visible, Kathy's is less visible, Joan Donovan, Ruha Benjamin, many of the people who are Mar Hicks, our work is less visible because big tech doesn't cherry pick funding our research. Most of us don't take big tech money to do our research. And that means that engineering schools and other computer science departments and those who are more amenable to being cherry picked, quite frankly, are able to do the kind of research that normalizes these technologies and puts them up front. And I'll add that the real risk, the risky dimensions of developing AI and other kinds of technologies is subsidized also by the government, by the public. So the National Science Foundation, NSF, and other agencies, they fund the high risk research, make it viable before venture capitalists back it. So the public really loses.
And this reminds me of sort of this notion that the Kleiner Perkins of the world, the VCs of the world, they're the high risk, cool cats who like take on the risk and bring it to market. But the National Science Foundation, National Institute of Health funded 40 years worth of research for that breakthrough drug that's now being touted as things. And I think we miss out on the taxpayers funded that investment. We took the highest risk as part of our public infrastructure, and it's under attack. So tell me a little more, and maybe Peter can come in just for a second, and then I want to kind of pivot a bit. But tell me a little more about what would a case for reparations look like? Like what is the stuff you're working on now, and what are you thinking about, and how would that come about? Because this feels like structural challenges.
I think that one of the challenges the pandemic has illuminated for many of us is that, and I'm writing right now about how as we talk about the economy collapsing or high rates of unemployment, a recession, you know, the sector that's really thriving is the tech sector, because everyone is captured, quite frankly. I mean, here we are having this conversation vis-a-vis the internet. So I think we have to ask ourselves why we don't have the resources in the state treasuries and in the federal treasury to really help us provide the kinds of resources, safety nets, and otherwise that need to be there. Why are our university systems so precarious? I just read an article last night about many universities wondering if they're going to have to close their doors. How could we put higher education, public schools, our public health at such peril when we have you know, the richest country in the world here and so much industry? And so these are the kinds of structural questions that I'm asking. And I actually think that the sector that I study is the tech sector, the big tech sector. And my question is, what does this sector owe the public? And to what degree can it keep extracting our data, our time, our attention to its profit and our peril, whether that's
Peter, I have a question
or
for you
otherwise.
here. It strikes me that this conversation about extractive tech, which is, you know, is particularly heinous as it has related to kind of amplifying ongoing racism or bias, but in many ways we're having this across the board, right? People are waking up to the fact that we have extractive capitalism, that we're being mined by tech. People probably were not aware until the 2016 election, the degree to which they were all caught up in a mechanism where they got manipulated and then they're the product of that. So one of the questions I have here is, you know, here we have this industry that's relatively new and probably only realized how consequential everything it was doing in the last decade. And now there's this reckoning. And my guess is that people in tech are probably, or have many of us are as shocked as the rest of us with kind of where we've arrived. So to what degree is a reckoning kind of a reparations for past things? And to what degree is it correcting, you know, the diversity of who writes code or what these objective functions are? And is the tech industry just completely adverse to this, or is there, you know, are they just not aware of responsibility and governance the way that, you know, in political stuff we have representative stuff? So I guess it's really two questions. One, to what degree is the tech industry resistant to this? And then secondly, isn't this part of some broader realization that there's a greater responsibility in the sector to all of us?
Yeah, I mean, I'll take the second part first. I mean, yes, there is a greater realization. And again, it's because some of us have forced a reckoning and a realization that these products are more than math. At the same time, I think that there's an attempt to capture some of that conversation and, again, ethics wash it or not denaturalize the role that these companies are playing in our society. So you see this when big tech CEOs say, we'll get together and we'll think about how to self-regulate the industry. Let us put forward, if I'm Facebook leadership, let us put forward the regulations that we'd like to see, if I may, because I think one of the challenges here too is that the technology and our kind of fixation on its ability to help us make better predictions, like are we distributing aid to people who are in crisis? Are we distributing PPP, SBA loans to people who really need them? Or are we giving them to the Lakers, right? The questions, like the questions that center the efficacy of the algorithm also preclude our ability to ask the questions like, why do these people need aid? What have we done about how we've organized the distribution of resources in our society that makes it that there will always be a permanent underclass of people, or that there will always be refugees, that there will always be people who we need to better predict, survival necessities to or not. Those are the kinds of questions that I think concern me about, again, our obsession with perfecting the technology. It creates a new market opportunity based on the exploitation of people rather than backing up and saying, you know, could we apply algorithms to thinking about how we would redistribute resources? Should we look at algorithms that ask us, you know, how do we deliver coronavirus vaccinations that would be predicated upon a public health model?
The points I heard, for whom does this fail? I think what Kathy said. I think that's a really interesting question to ask, and everyone should be asking this as a data scientist, as a business person, as just a citizen. And are you making unlucky people luckier? Because, we, in some ways, we need a chance sometimes. You mentioned when we talked earlier about the essay you're working on, that we should welcome our algorithmic overlords with pitchforks. You said you had sort of 3 key points that you were thinking about.
Yeah,
Can you
yeah.
just elaborate? Because one of them was a little bit about the Occupy side and what you saw there. Can you hit on those 3 points?
Yeah, I mean, I just mentioned them briefly, but I'll say them again. The first one is like we have a bunch of people who just sort of violently got thrown out of work all at the same time. So there is solidarity in that. And they know who each other is. And they were colleagues, so they know they're talking. That's a little bit different from the sort of historical picture that we had of like slow offshoring, like one company at a time. That's the first thing.
And you mentioned in the solidarity thing, I think you said, like, the point is they didn't do anything wrong.
That's the second point. That's the second point.
Okay. Tell me more about that.
These are people who do not feel shamed. Like what we usually do is we shame poor people. We shame people who are not working. We force them into all sorts of humiliating postures and behaviors in order to qualify for help. And these are people who are like, wait a second, this was a natural disaster. It had nothing to do with me. All of my friends and I are very good at our job. We want to be working and we have no shame. And it is ineffective to try to humiliate us. So they will be asking and demanding more. And they will be a political force with a political voice. And the final thing was that thing where, like, wait a second, you just managed to conjure up $3 trillion last week for your buddies. How about another $3 trillion for something that's useful to us and to frontline workers and to meat processing plant workers and all the other people we see dying at their jobs?
So it's almost like we can see that you can actually take action. That's the part I want to make sure I got.
Sort of like, how can we afford this is no longer an argument.
Yeah, that's kind of an erroneous argument. I just love it.
Probably we didn't realize that the thing that would catalyze very quick change in how America thinks about a problem and looks at things was the George Floyd and this particular police violence that was so horrendous, got so much attention and catalyzed interest not only all over the US, but around the world. And so we find ourselves in a moment that, particularly a week ago, was incredibly disruptive and frightening, and now is increasingly hopeful as there's a consensus or certainly a moving towards a realization of reimagining how we go about fundamental things, how we accomplish policing. I think there's been much more of a sensitivity among the privilege of what privilege is, where before people are oblivious to it.
People erupt to the injustice, whether there's a record of it or not. Now, one of the things that I think is incredibly powerful in this moment is the hyper circulation, certainly, of these images of videos and photographs of Black people dead or dying. And in the social media environment and the web, what we find is that those images are often about news spectacle. They feed into a 24/7 news media environment. And, the unfortunate part of that is that while we have much more visibility, we often find that the justice is not, in fact, rendered on behalf of the victims and their families of police brutality. And so the question, I think, is, even if we have the records, will we have the justice? Whether it's in the television environment of the 1990s or it's in the contemporary moment where, the world is seeking justice for George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, so many names. What we've tended to think is that if we had the records, if we had more records and more people saw the records, saw the evidence, saw the video, the photographs, that then there would be justice. But those things don't exactly line up. And so I think this is a really important conversation to have.
Yeah, I mean, it's as if back then it was as if people looked at that video and thought, you can't believe what the defense attorneys for the police were saying is that you can't believe your own lying eyes. That there's more to it. And the more to it, actually, is that in many of these cases, and it's going to happen in this case, the victim is often vilified by the police to justify what the police did to that individual. Now, it seems almost impossible right now to justify what that police officer did to George Floyd, but we will see.
Absolutely. I mean, we saw this immediately when Mike Brown was murdered in Ferguson, Missouri, that the most popular Google search on Mike Brown's name was his criminal record. We saw that this week in the case of George Floyd, that Google was auto-completing criminal record in association with George Floyd's name. So we know that these are organized efforts, both by people attempting to spread disinformation and discredit victims, or by the company's own kind of willful neglect, because those who might look at that kind of clickbait will help those companies make money. So I think it's, this is where we get into like the political economy, let's say, of Black death and dying. And again, the willful, I think, in many cases, or benign neglect of the whole ecosystem to find justice for the families and the victims. And this is, to me, the broader concern about how platforms and social media and search engines and the like drown out, in fact, the voices of people like you, Ms. Monroe, Black journalists and people who have the sensitivity and the nuance and the detail, quite frankly, to tell these stories.
So what we're up against is an entrenched culture of police behavior, and that is built upon a view that Black people, Black men in particular, are more dangerous, more violent, more devious than other people. And so a lot of people in the community who would sit on juries think, well, if the police had him down, he must have done something wrong. And so maybe we don't have the whole story. And time again, the other part of this is that police officers, in this sort of skewed view of Black people as being more dangerous and whatnot, one of the defenses is always, well, I feared for my life. Now, you tell me how in the world anybody feared for their life with the man on the ground and your knee on his neck, two other police officers standing up watching, and I'm told that in the other part there were other police officers holding him down the middle of his body. And yet, that may be part of this defense.
Well, absolutely. There's no question. We have many scholars who, in fact, are writing important work about the legitimation of the fear of Blackness through the courts. Of course, this is one of the really important reasons why we need critical race theorists, for example, in the field of legal studies, to help us understand how the fear or the allegation of fear can be weaponized to destroy and dehumanize Black people, Black lives. There's no question that this happens. It happens also in the propagation of disinformation and misinformation about Black people. And of course, this is where, I'm particularly concerned with how these systems, these media systems, by 1,000 cuts, dehumanize every minute of the day the voices, the experiences, the realities. And we see this across many fields. We see it in the medical field, for example, where Black doctors do not give sufficient care to Black people because they don't believe us when we say we're in pain, because they don't believe that we're telling the truth. Black people die because they are neglected by the medical establishment. There's a whole host of ways that this desensitization to the value of Black life. And I would argue, in fact, that the whole premise of this country was founded upon the notion that Black people were not human beings. So we are, in fact, not starting from a premise that Black people are human beings in the eyes of the law or in the eyes of this country. We're starting from the premise that we weren't human beings and trying to dig our way into pictures of humanity, quite frankly. And this is one of the reasons, to me, why it's so easy and so profitable for these companies, these media systems and so forth to engage with us on these terms.
And why it's so stressful to be African American in almost any sense, because at every turn you're struggling to affirm your humanity over and over and over again. We had a perfect example of what you're talking about, Sophia, in just this past week. Amazingly, a woman named Amy Cooper, who was walking her dog in Central Park off a leash, and there's a leash law there. And a Black man who was watching birds in the park asked her to put her dog on a leash. Instead, she makes a hysterical 911 call and says that she's being harassed by a Black man. Luckily, the gentleman videotaped the whole conversation that he had with her. And when the police arrived, they said, "What's going on here?" And she, still in her hysteria, said, this guy is harassing me. And it turned, this time the video helped this black guy because he hadn't harassed her at all. He simply asked, but it showed the power of that image of a black man as being so dangerous and violent.
Well, either of you derive hope just in this current last couple of weeks when there has been outpourings of support globally, or in the case of the event in Central Park, where the zeitgeist moved very quickly on how egregious that was. Are you deriving hope from the present moment that there's a mentality change, or does this, or maybe not? Maybe it both fits a pattern, and as you say, Dr. Noble, there are plenty of forces of disinformation. I'm wondering how you resolve the present moment.
Well, I wanted to say for sure that we know that the allegation of a threat to white people, white women in particular, is weaponized against Black people. And we have Emmett Till and Christian Cooper that we can point to. Thank God Christian Cooper survived and didn't become another Emmett Till who might be murdered at the false allegation, quite frankly, because we know, in fact, that the woman who accused Emmett Till of inappropriately engaging her, in fact, lied. So do I feel like there might be some potential? Well, certainly one of the things that we see in social media vis-a-vis what we call Black Twitter, or Black people who are on social media, in particular on Twitter, is that justice comes quite swiftly in terms of being named, being shamed, being outed, being held accountable in the court of public opinion in social media when people like, the woman who called the police on African Americans barbecuing in my old neighborhood in Oakland at Lake Merritt, or the latest Amy Cooper. So we know that, of course, people want to see accountability, and in the past, it was much more difficult to find these bad actors and make them visible. So sure, a culture of accountability in social media. Black people have used these systems to force the conversations into the public's view. And quite frankly, journalists pick up these stories and cover them. And so that's important. Does that bring about justice or shift the culture of white supremacy? I would say not. I would say if we look at the halls of power in this country, from the White House to the Supreme Court to the Senate, we have a regressive kind of moment that we're living in where we are seeing a full-blown rollback of civil rights. It's actually about systems that hold up the worst and the lowest common denominator actors, protecting them. If you don't get to the root causes, I just don't think that we're going to eradicate the kinds of problems and create the kind of social change that we want, and to really live in a fair society.
Dr. Noble, in the conversation around defunding police or reimagining law enforcement, is the concept to take it apart and then rebuild it in a more community manner, or to somehow rebuild law enforcement without those biases and structural stuff built in? What's the mechanism in the weeds that gets us from something that repeatedly doesn't work to something which we imagine accomplishes law enforcement without this baggage?
Well, I think first of all, the framework is around abolition and really understanding what abolitionists are calling for. The United States imprisons more of its citizens than any other industrialized nation in the world. It's a huge billion-dollar industry in this country. Many of the people who are incarcerated are people who have been, caught in the ensnared in drugs, people who needed mental health services, people for whom the education system failed them. There's a whole host of different kinds of people, not just violent offenders, who are imprisoned in this country. So defunding the carceral state, including the police and prisons, is really about reimagining the kinds of support that people in our communities need, whether it's homes, whether it's education, food, clothing, resources, social workers, mental health services. Those people should not be in prison. And of course, we know that when we have societies where people are highly educated, where they have the resources that they need to thrive, they are also less likely to commit violent crimes. So there's a whole, opportunity for us to reimagine how resources are deployed in our society equitably. When we talk about law enforcement, we're never really talking about enforcing, putting Wall Street traders who bankrupt our economy in prison. We're not talking about enforcing those kinds of laws. So even our idea of what criminality is, who's committing crimes. Is it a crime to deny protective equipment to doctors and nurses, but then see it rolled out in mass by the police in the streets who are confronting people who are exercising their democratic rights. I mean, all of these opportunities to talk about defund the police is really, I think, an opening for larger conversations about the distribution of our resources. And of course, I'm especially concerned with the tech industry because I find this industry has really been deeply implicated in social inequality in our country and in the world. They don't pay taxes. That's money that comes out of the public coffers. They use our public infrastructure, our post office, our roads. They take the cream of the crop of students to become their employees, and they don't pay their fair share back into the system. And of course, these are the systems that we need to support.
And we haven't used this word, and I don't, because white supremacy is so deeply rooted in the fabric of this country that people can dismiss things that they otherwise would not, because there's a blind spot. The white privilege creates a blind spot where they cannot see or feel the pain of other people.
These issues don't get resolved in the realm of beliefs. If the realm of beliefs were what mattered, then the world would be remade every time new people are born and new people die. But see, we're all born into and die from these systems that are in place. And so these are public policy investment conversations. And we cannot acknowledge the superpower, for example, the economic superpower that is the United States without recognizing that that is built upon the backs of free labor. You just cannot ignore that. There has to be a reckoning with that.
Nations have the ability to take on risk and fund projects that are outside the box thinking. However, the Ford Foundation just did an amazing report. If you haven't seen it, the cover of the New York Times, the foundation is going to take out about $1 billion of debt to be able to fund some programs because they see the need in the communities. However, no foundations, to my knowledge, are currently funding the acquisition of properties for creative interim use strategies in our low-income communities across the country. And so if we had access to those dollars, we'd be able to have a property get purchased, entitled for a community need for future use, so that then when a developer chooses to come in and buy that property, it actually meets a community benefit, as opposed to what we're seeing right now with opportunity zone investors coming in and building storage facilities. How many more storage?
Yeah, which do you really want those in your place? Yeah.
This is an interesting time to put on the table, since this is a show about how COVID drives innovation. And the Opportunity Zone program is one of the largest tax breaks in history, and it's famous for not having guardrails. Hence, somebody can go build a nice hotel, but maybe not help with a barrio. What are some of the things that you're thinking of proposing to foundations that can be the thread that we should be paying attention to here?
The main one is creating social impact funds for acquisition of properties from not just nonprofit, but also for-profit local community developers that don't have access to capital. And there was a comment made in I believe the live comments, which what San Francisco was doing, and I believe it's great. However, sometimes in our extremely low-income communities, our nonprofits are not considered to have the capacity, quote unquote, by some of the foundations to be able to take on some of this work. So I think it's great that you're funding capacity building, technical assistance to get a nonprofit ready. However, that 12 to 18-month period, you're losing an opportunity to acquire properties when you have high-end real estate developers with capital gains to purchase an OZs, swooping up those properties. So one of the recommendations that I have is, one, create social impact funds for acquisition at extremely low interest rates, not to exceed 3%. And those funds could actually be managed by people of color or diverse fund managers that foundations could hire to manage these portfolios. We see a lack of diverse fund managers across the country, and don't even get me started on the lack of diversity on some of the developers that are building in our neighborhoods. But funding development entities for rapid acquisition, providing funding for interim use property acquisition and placemaking, exactly what CoPlace is doing.
she'll be sharing a little bit about what she thinks is a sort of dark age of mind and meaning, and how do we get out of it? How do we enter the Enlightenment era of mind and meaning? So let's join Ting now. Ting, thanks for joining us today. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and then jump on into your presentation?
Thank you for having me here. So I work at Dana Realist Lab at Duke University, and our center's name is called Center for Advanced Hindsight. It's actually an actual nudge, keeping us aware of how we don't know things in foresight, and we only know it in hindsight or post-rationalized things.
I love that name. So yeah, share with us a little bit about the research you've been doing and what you've been working on. What is top of mind, and what are you excited about?
I am fascinated by how much we fail in promoting well-being.
Wow.
So if we look at the stats of mental health, depression, loneliness, stress, anxiety, stats of physical health, increasingly so many more people die and suffer from heart disease, cancer, diabetes. And during the lockdown time, I cannot help pondering about the question, are we really in a crisis of mind and meaning? And what is the problem really with our current approach that fails to make a real difference? Is it a problem of speed or actually direction? So our center's mission is to promote well-being, to help people be happier, be healthier. And what we need is not necessarily a tweak anymore. It might be a revolution in the approach. And I dare to provoke you that I believe, or I'm inviting you to answer this question with me. Are we in the dark ages of mind and meaning? So what's happening in the Middle Ages, in the Dark Ages, is that absence of science, absence of culture. And while we are championing in sciences like medical science and material science and rocket science, are we doing as well in human-related sciences? Not just in having, those disciplines and having those insights, but in applying them to our actual life, to real life. So if we look at all of these problems, they are as fatal as cancer, right? And if we look at heart diseases, in fact, we have scientific evidence proving that lifestyle, our behavior, our daily lives, decisions can be 4 times more effective in preventing those diseases and 2 times as effective as in curing than medicines available for them. And most unscientifically, we blame ourselves for not being successful in those lifestyle optimization and change. And once we realize what's wrong, what do? We make New Year resolutions about it. And after a month, a third of us already gave up.
They never work. Yeah.
But then we make the New Year resolution over and over. It's as if like taking that, Chinese herbal medicine. I mean, I've taken lots of Chinese herbal medicine in my life, but some of them really are not working, and we don't understand that we're not being scientific about it.
And we kind of blame ourselves, like we don't have enough willpower, or we should be able to do better. And we also maybe think that we're experts because we're human, we're inside of our bodies. And it turns out
intuitions, we have some partial knowledge about it.
Yeah.
And it makes us very kind of comfortable just resting on those, understanding. Especially in today's world. I mean, we Google about things and we feel good about, those partial knowledge. We don't realize that behavioral change and human decision making can be as technical as curing, cancer and bleeding. Changing our habits, what influences our behavior really goes beyond our attitudes and intention. There's a reason that we know not to hurt ourselves by putting our hands on fire or cutting ourselves, but we keep on staying up at night, overeat, text and drive, or smoke, which kill ourselves. Yeah. So it's not that simple. But this is quite a well-known example in behavioral science. These fascinating differences among cultures in organ donation rate. And if you look at it, you might see this maybe it's country differences. But then taking a second look, Netherlands and Belgium have very similar lowlands, right? One is having 28%, the other is 98% in organ donation. What explains the difference? Is it because one culture is more ethically minded? It turns out that the forms were designed differently. So by default, in the upper one is an opt-in. You check the box if you want to participate. And people don't check the box, they don't join. The opt-out one, you check the box if you don't want to participate. If you don't check the box, you don't, you join. So the default is actually what people go with. And it drives these drastic differences. And when we ask them, you know, why did you become an organ donor or not, nobody says, oh, it was the form and I just don't like to check boxes. And, you know, it was the easiest thing to go with, just the status quo, that I was autopiloting. I didn't think too much about it. They would make up beautiful reasons, like, you know, if I'm in, I care about saving people's lives. Or if I'm not, like, you know, what if the doctor cares about saving 6 people using all of my organs instead of, you know, really trying to save me. So this attribution to our intention and attitudes and not realizing how our environment has influenced us when we are in an autopiloting mode, and how often we are in the autopiloting mode. So really, I think the idea about choice architecture and how our external world has failed to take into account all the scientific insights that we know about human decision, and we've missed out tons of opportunities to help with our well-being, and partly the reasons why we are not making much progress, because we have been trying to put all the pressure, and people are already stressed out enough, and now like, you know, thinking that we are the problems. And so I think we need to really take a drastically different approach and get more scientific about this.
In the past, we as a scientific community thought that the brain was the kind of central engine that was not so connected to the rest of our body or the outside world and so on. Over time, we've understood that we can look at cognition much more fluidly. So think about the fact that you use your telephone to remember things, to speak to people. You might put your sunglasses on the door handle to remind yourself to go out. And we use buildings as our tools, and also as a way to extend our intent. So think about how you look around your space. How did you position different things around your space? That's your intent having a manifestation on the space. And everywhere you look around you, including places that you don't control, are representations of someone's intent or groups of people's intent to shape an experience. And so this connection between mind, body, space, and the way that these things are fluid gives us a different way to look at and assess our relationship with place. What is this space around us? What does it mean? What is it trying to do? And we recognize that design is a decision-making process, meaning each of the points of decisions in that process is a hypothesis that we say we believe doing X will have Y effect, or probability that there is a Y effect. So I am saying, let's redefine architecture, and I've taken this famous saying, architecture is frozen music, and say architecture is frozen intent. And through that looking glass, we can start understanding what spaces are and what design is, everywhere you look around it. So intent to welcome, intent to include people, for example, intent to keep out as well. The intent isn't always good. Intent to empower. So this is an example, personal example from my city, Tel Aviv. We have Rabin Square in Tel Aviv, which was designed within the brief with the intent to house over at least 40,000 protesters in front of City Hall. That's intent to empower democracy and intent to empower the voice of the people.
Wow.
The space is empty in the day-to-day, but it has to be empty for it to be able to house that volume of demonstration, large amounts of people. Take Trafalgar Square as another example. The 2 fountains that you see on the left and right, they're huge fountains that take up a large amount of floor space. They were installed there in 1840 something, 5 I think, to repress mass gatherings. So take up more space in your public square means less people can gather there. And so here is a hidden intent to repress. It's hidden within the beauty of a fountain, but the intent is something else. And so you use this lens to look at your city when you walk around the city and think about how it affects you. First of all, as we see it through our scientific lens, cognition. So how does space affect our cognition? That's our attention capacity, our creative thinking, the way we might empathize even. And how does it affect our metacognition, where it relates to our identity, our sense of belonging, our knowing of ourselves within the city and within our context. And the city has the power to do all these things.
And what I have a deep interest in is the impacts of architecture and urban planning on end users, and looking at that impact in some unique ways. So this idea of just architecture, or the just city, is a conversation that's been around for a few decades, but adding a new voice to it, and that's the voice of the community members themselves. And what I've done is I've created this way of using hip hop to talk about architecture.
And say more about that. I'm not sure everybody would understand how hip hop intersects with architecture.
Yeah, so I call hip hop modernism's post-occupancy evaluation. Right,
what's post-occupancy evaluation? Real quick, what's for non-architects?
So as a designer or an architect, if you design a hospital, after you finish at a hospital, you're going to talk with the doctors, the nurses, the building engineers.
So the people who are going to occupy it.
Right.
Did it work?
Exactly. You want to see how successful it was. You may even talk to
Yeah.
some of the patients about their experience. And the goal is the next time you build a hospital, it's even better than that. And what I say about hip hop was born in these modern ideas, these modern utopias for inner cities, right? So the work of Le Corbusier and some of these modernists that are celebrated unintentionally laid the groundwork that would birth hip hop in the Bronx. And what hip hop music is, if you listen to it, it is a unsolicited, unfiltered critique of the environments from which the culture was born.
Yeah, these are artists who are reacting to what they're feeling in these concrete jungles, right? In these places that maybe weren't designed for them, or weren't designed for really the people who have to live there.
Yeah, it was this idea that not only, you think about the architecture for most public housing projects. What's interesting, the architecture was designed like a crucifix. If you look at the form from an aerial view, and this is Le Corbusier's idea of architecture as a machine. He believed that people, once they inhabited the space, you can create a better person if the architecture is a machine. And he believed that this crucifix form, along with all the programmatic elements, would create a better working class citizen. Very interesting way that modernists thought, but hip hop tears all that shit up and just says, this was your idea of urban renewal, but here's the reality of urban renewal. So I juxtapose lyrics with statements from what architects and urban planners thought they were going to achieve, and again show what they actually did through hip hop. Right now in the United States, less than 3% of licensed architects are African American. Less than 0.2% are African American women. So very few of us are responsible for designing and building our communities, which we all know has a profound impact on whether you are successful or not in the long run, right? There's our buildings, our spaces either deny or perpetuate injustices. And unfortunately, it's not a lot of us who are part of those design efforts. So my goal by using is to make architecture relevant. And it's not a gimmick. Some people think you will just assign a song and dance to architecture. Now people will flood. No, we're giving people a real challenge to solve some of the systemic issues that are perpetuated by built spaces. And we're allowing them to explore the lyrics of their favorite MCs who have given or provided some provocative solutions to some of the problems. So not only does our music critique, but it also provides a glimpse of solutions. So with that 3%, I'm looking to raise that number by making the profession relevant and giving a direct charge and ultimately a new vernacular for young people coming into the profession, be complacent with designing those backdrops of injustice. And we have to think of architecture as something beyond bricks and mortar, and that's what the Just City is. It's looking at design beyond bricks and mortar, but what are the policies, laws that are housed within our spaces?
There's a lot going on here, but it almost feels like every single thing is about either motivating us to be healthier, trying to teach us to be a better, steward of our own health. And I think those are all fine, but it almost feels like everything we're pushing against is pushing against us pretty hard. And how has COVID and these collection of epidemics, the epidemic of structured racism and the epidemic of police brutality and the epidemic of COVID and sort of the challenges of having a kind of coordinated scientific conversation and response, it feels like there's also this feeling that it's really hard to be healthy. And why is it so hard to just live a healthy life? Why can't we just be healthy in the act of being us? And kind of tune ourselves and be tuned and have the environment, the products, the services, the places, the policies, all kind of shape that.
One of the things I is really sort of stunning to me is to look at the rise in chronic conditions in the country over the last 5-6 decades. And I know we have a few slides on that in terms of things like diabetes, which has gone from one of Americans in 1960 to around 10% right now. Peter mentioned obesity. It's at 42% of American adults. Used to be, back in like 1960, it was 14%. And actually, severe obesity, which is a whole other level. That was about 1% in 1960. It's now 9%. And it's actually projected to go to 24% by the end of the decade. And if you just sort of look at some of the slides, they may be a little hard to read, but the idea is think about something that's just been growing steadily for 50, 60 years. That's severe obesity. It's going up 5.5% each year over the last 5 years. As Peter said, we like to jump in and fix things that are acute, but this is really sort of a slow rolling problem, right? And actually, a lot of these conditions are in effect sort of behavior related. And I think one of the things that we've learned over the years is that behaviors, are some element of free will, but they're also very easily shaped and manipulated. I think the whole field of behavioral economics shows us that. And as I was looking at all of this and looking at sort of the role of technology and kind of shaping our lives, I drew that very simple conclusion, which is that it's become hard to be healthy. And it sounds kind of flip, kind of simplistic. But I guess what I'm getting at is that when the numbers for chronic disease are as high as they are, it's sort of no longer a question of everybody's just needs to try harder. Clearly there are challenges. I mean, I think that the interesting things around some of the changes is that they sort of work perhaps in both directions. One of the things I've been really interested in is actually the things that make us healthy. And I think they're sort of traditional things that we look at. It's like, oh, it's diet and it's exercise and it's medical care, it's genetics and all of that. But there's more and more work that says it's things like social connection. It's things like actually spending time outdoors. It's things like getting more sleep. And so some of and of course everybody's experience is different. In COVID, the difference between let's say a worker who can work remotely, and not have to commute and stay in their home and be able to spend more time with family is obviously very, very different from, let's say a frontline health worker, a nurse's aide, or somebody who is having to get up early in the morning, take public transportation to get to a hospital and work a long day. So I think that's important to recognize. But for some people, there are really positive changes in the, they're not spending an hour and a half in a car going back and forth to work, and that's time that they're actually spending with family. Obviously, the social aspects of not being able to sort of be present physically with people is hard, is hurtful to a lot of folks. Although again, some people have been creative about being in touch with more people, actually, sort of virtually. So I think it's a mixed bag in that sense. There's more cooking at home, I think, which is a good thing. So it's sort of all over the map on that. I think what's potentially important is it's also a moment where people are perhaps more in touch with sort of what their everyday routine was and what it is now, and perhaps what they would like it to be.
My journey in healthcare started as a health psychologist, working primarily with people who had been diagnosed with cancer. And so I kind of got started in the realm of folks, health had been taken away from them. And was, whether it be physical health or mental health as a psychologist, and in some cases both. And so having the opportunity and the privilege to work with folks from whom health had been taken and watch them battle mightily to preserve the health they had and regain the health they could, instilled in me a real sense of health as something very sacred, and to observe the ways, as Steve put it so well, that certainly modern American culture, I think, does push a current against us when it comes to health. There's a part of me that responds to that with a lot of agitation and a lot of anger, and I think we need to take up arms and fight back hard, because when someone has health taken from them, just the grace and strength that people show as they work to regain it or work to preserve what they have is formidable, and people do that every day. But there's whether it be the inequity or just the degree to which we know what's behind some of what pushes those currents against us. We know the financial interests that are behind some of that. We know the capitalism and the greed that's behind some of that, and it's killing us quite literally. So I have a lot of passion related to putting health within equal reach of everyone and making health accessible and making health affordable. And so, that's kind of what my come from is on all of this. And I think that as I look at the great, from two statements that Steve's Medium article laid out, which I think are just brilliant. I'll say that a couple of them really stand out to me, but certainly the one at the end, and Steve, I don't know if it was intentional as that one is like the foundational one, but making health of value. And I think that word value is important because, you know, do we value taking the time that we need to sleep, to eat, to move, and to connect? Just those four things. And I would argue, and I think you're arguing here, we don't attach near enough value to that. Most of us in our daily lives aren't probably particularly incentivized to even, you know, it may be an act of courage to even say, I value those things, and I'm going to architect my life in a way that reflects I value those things, even if it means I have to, and those things take time. You know, as we've talked before, I'm really kind of obsessed with the degree to which time as a concept is so front and center here, because it takes time to sleep. It takes time to move, to prepare food, to connect with others. And so much of how we live our lives, and to some extent, a role that technology plays, it's been to engineer time out of every equation or to minimize the time requirements of everything we do. And I think sometimes that's been to our great detriment, that there's a reciprocity that we can sort of play out through the commitment of time to things as a way to express the degree to which we value them. And that's another thing, you know, when health is taken away from someone, and I think the pandemic has put all of this in stark relief for all of, you know, how do we get back to thinking about the things that we value and the time that we have left to enjoy them and to participate in them? And why do we feel threatened by something like a virus that could be life-threatening? Well, because it would take time. It would take our time away, the time that we have to be with the people who we love, to do the things that we feel passionate about. And so I think we need to, you know, acknowledge that health takes time. There are certainly ways that technology and other things can help health be easier and to maybe help health take less time, but that we need to value and stand front and center and say, you know, it takes time, and that's time I'm willing to commit, and that I feel like I live within a culture, whether it's my microculture of my own internal self and well-being, or the culture of my family, the culture of my employer, the culture of my community, that time is important to take in the service of health and well-being. We know in many, you know, there's clear evidence that outsourcing American fast food to other countries shows a rising in obesity in those countries, you know, on a path that is, you know, sort of a decade or so kind of behind us. And one of the questions that begs, though, I mean, is what are people getting from the immediate gratification of salty, sugary food or another show on? What are we getting from that we aren't getting from something that doesn't have this secondary effect of being harmful, right? And I would argue that, I mean, I can't sit here and say I don't ever eat fast food, or I don't love ice cream, or I don't love to binge on Netflix. But when that becomes so present in our lives that we sort of incur all of these negative effects, it begs the question: what do you not have to give you pleasure, to give you comfort, to give you happiness? That you're using these things instead of. And that, I think, is related to the underlying epidemic of lack of connection and loneliness that we know exists not only, I think, in America, but kind of all over. And again, I would argue part of that is because we don't put time in to connecting with others in an authentic way. And we don't yet really consistently use connectivity to promote connection, which is, I mean, and in some cases we do, you know, there's lots of examples, but clearly there are ways of using connectivity to promote connection that we should deepen and continue to perpetuate, because I think that some of what's going on there is we don't have an underlying fabric of connection to others. So we engage in behaviors that are immediately gratifying, but ultimately not very healthy. And that's a big problem. One really, you know, there are lots of things I'm hopeful about. And as one example, I'm a member of a professional society called the Society of Behavioral Medicine. And our motto is better health through behavior change. We're a group of about 2,500 health professionals, mostly working on different angles of this problem. And a couple of years ago, we had an organization come to our annual meeting called Girl Trek. And if you don't know about Girl Trek, it's an incredible organization that has definitely used connectivity to promote connection, but they form walking groups of African-American women. And it's rooted in the idea that these people's ancestors walked to freedom. And now you're walking again to escape the trappings of poor health that disproportionately affect African-American men and women. And so these walking groups form, they create connection. These women walk to healthier lives. And there's just so much meaning at every level of it. And it, you know, maybe some of them go on to train for marathons, but that's not the point. It's just to be together, to walk, and to have an experience of shared connection in the service of health in recognition of a history that is just so powerful. And there are other examples of things like that, but Girl Trek really stands out to me. And I think UPMC, a couple of the things that I feel really hopeful about and good about is that from the get-go, our CEO, who has a background in behavioral health, has said physical and behavioral health cannot be disentangled, and we can't behavioral health, and we need to keep both front and center as we go about trying to help people live healthier lives. And also, a big topic in the last several years, and Karen DeSalvo, who now is the Chief Health Officer at Google, has written a lot about this. Health systems have to take some responsibility for jumping in and addressing the social determinants of health, which are a lot of what some of the current running against us, where those come from, problems related to equity. And the UPMC Center for Social Impact is taking those head on, as are other healthcare systems who have said, we have to take some responsibility for addressing these problems. So, and those are, again, like, whether it be addressing behavioral health, addressing social determinants, equity, all examples of how we truly can find the best in one another. And this is what you've showcased on Quarantime, from the beginning, where amid a global pandemic, humans are good at making and at figuring things. We've been pretty good at wrecking things, but we're also quite good at figuring out where to find cracks to push ourselves through, where the light's coming in, and just really kind of expand that. And, I think Building H is doing that. We're doing that in health. We're doing that in the service of population health. And it all really, I think, at the end of the day, comes back to connecting with a sense of, shared humanity and just love for one another. That if we root ourselves in that, we can do amazing things.
So Audrey, I want to hear a little bit more about some of the good news. Some of the, like, Pittsburgh doesn't seem to be stopping at other business startup tech side of things. Because Pittsburgh obviously was seen as the steel city for a long time. It went through its own kind of troubles after the sort of closing of the steel mills, but then kind of came up fairly early and became kind of a hub for machine learning and robotics. And obviously one of the vaccines, the polio vaccine, came from University of Pittsburgh with Jonas Salk. So there were like a lot of things going there. You've been a part of that, kind of bringing tech companies like Google, Amazon, Uber, others to the region because of the brains and because of the can-do kind of making. What are some of the bright spots that you're seeing right now?
Well, it's pretty crazy, because there really have been some incredible bright spots. In health information technology, obviously that would make common sense. We're seeing a lot of stability there. We're seeing a lot of growth. We're seeing a lot of new contracts that people are getting. There's a company called Astrobotics that's not an overnight success, been around for about 12 years, and they've been come out of Carnegie Mellon, and they've launched this company that's taking payloads to the moon, taking maybe people to the moon, and just were awarded a $200 million NASA contract, and their growth is exploding. We can't hire enough roboticists, to keep up right now, and so it's pretty exciting times that people want to come to Pittsburgh. If you're interested in space and you're interested in trying to solve really hard problems in terms of what's next out in our galaxy, people come to
And that just happened very recently, like during COVID.
That's
this was announced
last week. That's what's like last week. A company that has been involved in voice and understanding patterns and behaviors in voice. A company called Voci just had a huge exit right in the middle of all of this, and then they're adding staff and they're adding people. But what you see are trends about the kinds of things that matter in this world. What things that matter. Now, going to the moon might not matter, and the privatization of going to the moon might not matter, but maybe it really does. And there's a lot that we're going to be able to learn from this privatization movement of innovation.
Why is today unlike other days that we have the Socratic format?
Well, the key to Socratic questioning is that we ask questions to reveal that we don't know what we're talking about.
As we start today, Bill, the first idea and reading we have comes from Alex de Tocqueville, who comes to America in the 1850s to observe our democracy. And in this first reading, he talks to us about individualism in democratic countries. And he's a little conflicted. America's always had this thing between the individual and his or her liberty and the community. We even see that today. The individual says, I don't know if I should, why do I have to wear a mask? Tell us what he says, because he writes that individualism is a novel expression, and as a social condition, it's something to be suspicious of, but Americans combat this with free institutions.
Yes, he distinguishes it from selfishness. He says it's a bad judgment. So the more equality you have, he says Americans think they can make it on their own. Hey, I've got enough. I've got my house. I'm independent. And he says they don't know how much they depend on other people. In other words, Aristotle would say the pursuit of happiness is a cooperative, not a competitive venture. You cannot be happy alone. Tocqueville sees the same thing. But he says this individualism brought on by equality, the more equality I have, I make a misjudgment that I can withdraw with just my friends, my family, my neighborhood, behind my guarded wall, and I don't need anybody else. And he says you'll end up in tremendous loneliness and isolation. He says, but Americans combat this by their private associations. They form associations for all sorts of things. And the intellectual and moral associations, he says, that's how we reconnect. And that's the fabric of American society. But as we know, Robert Putnam wrote his book, Bowling Alone, where he's saying that these Tocquevillian associations have broken down, and that we don't associate as much as we used to, don't do it as well. And so that individualism is the belief that I have everything I need and I don't need society at large. And Tocqueville says it not only harms society, but as individuals, it threatens to confine us entirely within the solitude of our own heart. And so to associate, and that's what the Aspen Institute was. It was an intellectual moral association, bringing people together from all different backgrounds, getting to know people, getting connected with people. And Tocqueville says that's
as a heads up.
One question that I kept asking myself when reading it is equality sometimes misunderstood as sameness. Because that's the opposite kind of also individualism in a sense. And is that misunderstanding also what people are a little bit reeling against today, is that if we're equal, are we all the same? And I think it's a really important point that we're not.
And actually that comes up in, I believe, Bill, Lincoln writes about that. When he critiques the Dred Scott decision, he tries to distinguish between, obviously everybody's different, versus there's certain rights that we have and aspirations that we share, right? Because we kind of get to that a little bit later in the readings.
Yeah, Connie just brought up a point that would have brought Mortimer Adler out of his chair with excitement. And that is coming to terms and the difference between sameness and equality. And so I think that point, what do we mean by equality? So that's a great lead in, Connie. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All Adler's saying, I'm taking this to human rights now. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All human beings everywhere in the world are by nature, he's leaving the theological part out. In your human nature, all are equal. And Adler would say, now, what do you mean by equal? What do you mean by true? And what do you mean by equal? And so I have to share with you, Connie, at one time, somebody was trying to distinguish same and they had their readings. We had our readings at the seminar. And the person sitting next to Adler said, well, my readings are identical to yours. They're the same. And Adler says, no, they're not the same. And he picked the guy's reading up and ripped them in half. Okay, they're not the same. He just a simple, they're different in number, they're different in place. So that distinction, so I think that's a great lead in for all of us to think about now. And that distinction and coming to terms. So Adler would say, you see, if I make this sound, I'm holding up this object, and I make the sound pen, P-E-N, and that's a sign of a concept I have. And the concept in my mind is a pig pen, an enclosure for animals. And if you thought writing utensil, we're talking right past one another. So Connie has a perfect lead in for what he talks about of taking time to come to terms on what we think we know. Oh, I know what equality means, okay? And so that's a great lead in. What does that term mean before we can say, is everyone equal? And so that's an equivocal
But
term.
I think there's the sameness. It just also appeared to me that the notion of individualism over selfishness being a democratic ideal. I mean, this is my reaction. But it was actually interesting to read so long ago, this notion that if we succeed in making everybody have this justice, this equality, and society moves upward, that means more and more power. A natural output of that will be individualism. And
that's his argument. The more economic equality.
That's the argument. The more economic equality people have, the more people will think they got there without anybody else's help. And,
right.
And his claim, of course, is associations, were a way that, people would feel that they were connected to somebody else. They would,
the great chain
feel
of
their small decisions.
the great chain of being he had, where God's on the top, then there's the king, the nobles, the eldest son gets, he said that chain's been broken. And Tocqueville, as a nobleman, says it should be broken. This is progress. Democracy, he's telling all the nobility, look, this is progress. But he's looking at two things there. He sees the tyranny of the majority, but equal economic situations. We think we can withdraw. And so Tocqueville thinks federalism is great. Federal, state, local. And it's great. I didn't put it in, but he just like, if somebody's going to build a road across your private property and you go down to City Hall and you got to be arguing about that. Tocqueville says that's a great way to combat individualism. All of a sudden you realize, wait a minute, I got to be so he thought federalism was great.
It's kind of about the common
all
good,
centralized
versus the individual.
Yes.
When it comes to economic equality, that's definitely a true statement in a lot of cases, right? It's when it's like, say, the example of like, if you're rich, you're not really concerned about the problems of the poor or those around you, or like that's where class structures start to build. Where and there was a part in that reading that was around the idea that when you have this system where like material conditions are kind of like overall good for everybody compared to what it would have been like 100 years for the average person who was like lower class or poor in poverty. Even someone poor today lives like a king comparatively to the past. So it's easy to get comfortable in that. And if you have a higher wealth in the way the world is now, then you're living very comfortably. So most problems don't affect you as long as you stay within a certain scope, right? So yeah, it's definitely a true statement. And I think as a result, it leads into like unintentional lack of empathy to those that have to rely on others and don't have the advantages, right? That don't have the ability to just be like, oh yeah, I can just stay over here and don't have to, like, others have to fight. Whereas if you don't have to fight, you don't see the need to empathize. So there's something in there that I hope we can discuss a little more into. And then
that's interesting. Let me see if I understand your point there. If I'm following your point, you're saying you see Tocqueville's point that even like the poor live like kings in the past. So this tendency of individualism, if I understand your point, is it can lead to lack of compassion or concern for others because you've just withdrawn and you don't think you need the rest of the world, so you have no connection. Is that the point that you're making?
Yeah, exactly. And that's kind of what leads into people having echo chambers, right? Is you stay within your scope because like everything's fine for us. That's why often, at least arguments that I face a lot when I'm talking to people who I'm trying to convince that yes, racism is real. They'll be like, well, I don't know what they're complaining about. Everything's fine for me. Everything's fine for my one black friend. It's like, well, not for everybody else. Maybe in your community, in your cul-de-sac, perhaps.
Maybe they're also just tired of telling you, that's not good for their black friend. It's just that they're sick of talking about it. They've already fought the battle today.
Yeah, they feel like they have their
I like that.
individualism.
I think
Like they have their independence and individualism, so therefore they assume if they were able to reach it, then others should have been able to as well. And it's because they're not getting that perspective, and thus the lack of compassion occurs because they're not able to empathize on the same level because they believe in their individualism, which they believe, and leading into the idea of like sameness, right, and individuality is that they believe everybody's on an equal footing just because the Constitution says all men are created equal, right? Even though that was in reference to, the colonists being equal to
there's almost this
the British.
I have to.
There's almost this embarrassing thing that you see with a lot of commencement speeches. Oh, go ahead, Bill.
No, what speeches? I didn't hear. What speeches?
Commencement speeches. You'll get like, some famous person stands up and says, follow your passion. I did. I'm a billionaire. You should. And there's this kind of naivete that actually it wasn't that they happened to be in 1982 and everybody who happened to be in Silicon Valley and the Silicon Valley Computer Club happened to also turn into Bill Gates and Steve Jobs. It wasn't that there was serendipity. It wasn't that their parents didn't support them or other things. They did it all themselves. And if you just follow the first thing that pops into your head because they did, it's almost like, they are confusing the reality of the world and thinking it's all them. It's that.
Let's add to that.
Selfishness.
We have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and so that's another complex term is happiness. And but Aristotle on happiness is a combination of virtue and good fortune. He's the only moral philosopher who says part of making it is just luck, and there are a lot of people that just hate that part. He just some people were lucky; they were in a certain circumstance that was lucky for them. Americans don't like that. They like that you're in control of this. But back to the echo chamber, I just have to give you a quick quote from Plato talking about the same problem that we have when you withdraw with just your friends, or it's just your friends that in your certain chat room. And he calls it the great beast. And that's these little faction groups, these beasts. And he has them, they're in a canyon where they're only talking to people who agree with them. And then they hear their echo back. And he says, when they meet together, this is from Plato's Republic, there's a great uproar. And they praise some things which are being said or done and blame other things, equally exaggerating both, shouting and clapping their hands. And the echo of the rocks and the place in which they are assembled redoubles the sound of the praise or blame. At such a time, will not a young man's heart, as they say, leap within him? Here's the question. Will any private training enable him to stand firm against the overwhelming flood of popular opinion, or will he be carried away by the stream? Will he not have the notions of good and evil which his group have? So I think that's a great tie-in. What you've led us to is that you retreat into
just out of
individualism.
curiosity, though, do you have like
what strikes me though is
do you have all of these things just sitting out in front of you? Do you have every piece of wood possible from all the way back to Aristotle, like laid out? I don't know where you put. It's amazing. Anyway, sorry, Connie, you were going to say something.
Well, I tell you, that's a quick point on that. Dr. Adler was not a classicist. He's like, if it doesn't help me today, I don't really have much interest in it. I appreciate that people are translating it. So I was looking at this beast related to this social media like 6 months ago. And so I'm always, Mickey, trying to see, has anybody talked about this? And I looked at what Plato was saying, and I'm like, what, we have that problem and worse.
So it's fresh in
I
your
think
head,
that's a great lead, that de Tocqueville goes to individualism. That individualism cuts off our compassion for others that we don't have contact with. And then I think it's a fantastic insight that individualism that we only listen to those with whom we already agree, and we live in this echo chamber. So I think Connie was going to jump in here.
Less stressful. Yeah.
To me, one thing that immediately comes to mind, especially on the echo chamber, is the rise of Hitler in Germany. I do think we have actually examples in history that show us maybe the good and the bad of how these things happen. And so I think that was definitely the case of an echo chamber. And then the echo chamber completely crashed. So then you did have kind of economic equality, but on the very low standard, because nobody had anything and everybody felt the responsibility to be a good citizen, to uphold rights. Germany abolished its constitution and created a basic law that had nothing to do with the constitution anymore. And they scrapped everything because they realized we can't evolve, we need to change. But then over time, I think because material standards increased again, you did get this economic equality where people are way more passive again. And that's a problem that Germany faces today, again, that I think people forget why, and people forget to remember, and to work for the ideals that we strive for. The German basic law starts with this great sentence now that is, human dignity is inviolable. Nothing else how we started. But the point is, human dignity is inviolable. And we tend to start to forget again.
Yeah, Adler was arguing that point with Moyers. My hope for the future is that understanding that idea and that ideal, Connie, okay, that if you understand that, that could be a hope for the future of the young people. But you brought up another point, Connie, to this discussion. I think it's important. You said passivity. So now we have, I'm an individual, Tocqueville. I've got this economic equality. I can retreat on my own. And then that cuts me off from my compassion with other people. And I live in this echo chamber. But what you've added, Connie, it can make good citizens passive. And then the troublemakers are always motivated. The troublemakers are always motivated. And so the potentially good citizen, you've pointed out, can retreat into a passive mode, which is very dangerous.
And in fact, Adler talks a lot about the fact that being a citizen has to be an active thing. He wants you to read these documents the way that a good churchgoer is constantly reading the scripture and renewing herself with that. And that becomes an issue in society today, that, you have factions that push what they believe in. And if we're not being all active, vigilant citizens, there's a hazard to that. A different framing, a creative framing that might help us approach what the connection of conversation looks like, the jazz of conversations, and that is jazz itself. Bill, you're very into jazz, and we've talked about the fact that jazz, which is the individual and the group and going back and forth, is actually a model for a way of having a conversation or getting along, and it's a mechanism that both allows the solo but allows the group to happen.
Yeah, and that's Stanley Crouch, great writer on jazz, Eric Williams on jazz. Wynton Marsalis talks about this, and that is the rest of us see the individual and the group in conflict. And I'm a basketball player, so basketball players, we don't see that either. You know, it's how you work together in your group. And so in jazz, we see that the individual only reaches their greatest heights in their collaboration with the group. And jazz has this improvisation to it, which is like a live conversation. And then Peter, you get a solo, and the rest of us listen in comp. You know, and then Connie gets a solo, and the rest of us listen in comp. How do you have your individual voice and help the group to get better? How does the group help you excel? And so the individual only reaches their highest development in coordination with the group. The group grows as the individual contributes more. So that model of the jazz conversation, Connie, I think that's the one more relevant to what's going on out here today, is improvisation and how you move in and out of the group, and how the individual's not crushed, but how the individual works within the group. So I think it's a great model for us.
And it's not an accident that jazz is a great American form. You can connect jazz back to Tocqueville, right? Back to those Americans have a need to associate. And jazz was built out of the cultural conflict of African Americans and Caribbean and Eastern European people all connecting up, right? So there was there's a model there.
Yeah.
Well, the individual, the group, our institutions, you see a connection point here. And we should bring Jocelyn back. Very instructive to kind of look at all of that stuff, and really interesting to end up with Cathers and taking a look at in our history that we make progress collectively as a group, but we are very individual people in America. And this whole conversation on institutional failure, or the fact that at a time like this, we're putting stress on so many of our institutions, our public health institutions and our media institutions. This highlights kind of the urgency and these kind of timeless conversations. It's just very interesting. Thank you for putting these together, because it's kind of the work is listening and seeing the connections.
Thank you for the opportunity, Peter. I really enjoyed the whole process.
I think we lost Mickey. He'll come back, but every time we do this at around this hour, his internet goes out after the main part of the show. So I mean, there were several really interesting things that went on there. So one question I have is, when you studied in school, did some of these other things come up? Were you studying Plato and Aristotle and the connection between, how we've worked through governance historically and how it applies to issues today?
Yes, exactly. So I'm in political science right now, and that's why one of our major courses is to really learn how these philosophers' philosophy can be transferred to our modern day lives, and how we can use those philosophies to further improve our decision-making process in the future. So I feel like that episode was definitely a highlight on how to actually incorporate those traditional thoughts into our modern world, which was just super fascinating.
The other point he brought up, and this has been a theme since the start of the pandemic, is this whole issue of federalism. That one of the strengths of America is that we have so many cities and states, and they are, of course, the laboratory of democracy. So on the one hand, and people trust local institutions more. On the other hand, in a national event like this, it's clear that there isn't a national coordination. So this tension between what happens nationally, what happens locally, and how polarization feeds into that is a through line that I thought got wrapped up there. Welcome back, Mickey. We were commenting that it's always at this hour that your internet goes out and then comes back.
It does. I'm on the phone now. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great. Hey, Jocelyn, I'm curious, in going through all the episodes, and, you were tuning in during them as well and looking at kind of understanding them. What surprised you? Like what was like an idea that you had not encountered before, or a point of view that you had not encountered before, like in your school or in your experience so far?
Right.
That you actually was like, whoa, okay, I've got to tell my friends about this, or I got to think about this.
Right. I think one really major point was how space shapes how we think. Because oftentimes we just think, oh, it's because of us who are making all these decisions for ourselves. Whereas a lot of the times it's the space and the external factors that shapes how we think, what we do, how we feel, and how we react. So I think that was a really interesting point of view.
That was like Ting talking about some of the
Right.
things, and also Ellen and Steve just talking about, I think both of all those, and even Michael talking about hip hop architecture.
Yeah.
And a lot of things had more to do with space than I would have expected. Yeah, that was really fascinating.
It also turns out throughout history, pandemics and medical scares like this have shaped our spaces, right? They shaped people going from the city to the country to get away. They shaped the zoning of within cities. Pandemics going back to the very earliest plagues moved along trade routes as they do today. And there's a whole very interesting connection. I think guns, germs, and steel, and the other one kind of cover this. There's an historical. We're going
so Jared Diamond's work. Yeah.
Yes. So there's what we're in now, which is to people who are alive today, unprecedented, and therefore is the reason that if you looked at all of these shows, the reason we're seeing so much innovation and thinking going on now is precisely because the routine went away and we're looking at what humans are capable of adapting.
And we're not in the same kind of places and context. One of the people that we have in an upcoming show said to me the other day when we were prepping for the upcoming show, context is decisive. And I thought, oh, what does that mean? And she said, well, when I moved from, East Coast to West Coast, like it changed what I expected and what I thought would happen. And Jocelyn, I imagine when you like spent time in Singapore, like context, like you were just immersed in something. Tell me a little bit about that. Like how did moving there versus Vancouver, like how did that change your whole outlook?
Right. That's what I was about to say. I feel like a lot of the stress of my generation comes from this anxiety. We don't know what the future holds for us. Our job market, the environment, food resources in the future, those are so uncertain for our generation today. And I feel like that's adding some stress to our day-to-day life, just without even knowing it in the back of our head. Right.
Yeah.
So one thing that I went to Singapore and I realized, like, wow, like things are very different from here than Vancouver. I feel like when I was in Vancouver, I was almost in a bubble, right? It was like a West Coast city. We were a very relaxed city. The stereotype of people doing yoga all the time, hiking all the time.
Right. Everyone's biking or yoga.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But Singapore really inspired me. Singapore pushed me to challenge myself constantly. And I feel like that's what a world-class city teaches you.
What's an example of being pushed? Like when you got to Singapore, and it's a week or a month in, what did you find yourself pushing towards? Like what did you find? How did you find it changed you?
I think first is adaptation for sure. But second is just pushing yourself to understand in everyone's perspectives, right? This whole exchange journey really made me realize everyone has their own perspectives for a reason. There's always a story that's backing it up, and no one's always right or always wrong because everyone has their own point of view.
We jumped to some conclusion. A good friend of mine and a mentor of mine a long time ago, Russ Sabo, he said, perspective is a beautiful thing. And I said, what do you mean by that, Russ? He's like, you actually have to be there. You have to walk 100 miles in their shoes, not a mile. You have to actually be there when they're actually under that constraint, and you learn so much. So don't try to second guess other people. Like you have to just be there. And it sounds like that's what that taught you a little bit.
Exactly. And with their environmental initiatives, I was constantly just thinking, how can our generation kind of cope with this fastly changing world, with COVID, with all these diseases and all of these uncertainties?
Did you have a sense that because it's more of a command and control government and economy, they had a better handle on things because they could just set a set of objectives and deal with it?
I think for sure, yes. For example, in Singapore, so there's pros and cons, I believe, in every single type of government, right? But in Singapore, you see this increase in safety. I don't have to look back, turn my head back all the time to see if anyone's following me or hiding my keys away in my pocket. Like those are so safe. 3 a.m., if I'm walking in the street, there's no problem. But with COVID, like at first they controlled it really, really well. And that's because the citizens are very law abiding citizens. They follow whatever the government says. And through that, they were really collaborating in a really good way. I don't know what happened at the end. I think there was like an outburst for, foreign talent coming in. So they couldn't really control it at the end, but they did pretty well.
I have a question. You're now having looked at all of this stuff and thinking through these enormous implications, what do you think some future shows should be on? Either people to talk to, or topics to cover, or issues to help?
Right.
Could just be even like people you wish you could talk to.
Yeah.
You like to engage. It's totally be selfish a little bit. It's okay. We just saw the 4th of July episode. But selfishly, like, who would you love to be on to interview?
Wow. Referring to what William Cather said in our show, right? Like, he is super, super optimistic about my generation, right? This young generation, because through working with us, he realized that we have a really good political stance. We are engaged in political activism, steering our society in a better direction. So I definitely would love to bring the spotlight onto more young leaders and see how they can kind of implement this activism into how they can benefit our society in the future. And I feel like a lot of the times, the leadership in my generation starts with, a lot of the social media influencers, or just influencers around our online community. So it would be really, really fun if we can kind of interview some of the influencers and see how they are using their free platforms to impact our world today.
Can we have you put together a
Do you have
list?
any specific examples? Yeah.
Wow.
Like people who come to mind for you, just personally, like who you nod your head, like you see what they're doing, you're like, damn, that's good. That gave me ideas. Because that's what I do. I mean, Peter and I think both, when we read a book or when we read something online or whatever, like, oh, I want to talk to that person. And we just reach out. We just ask them. And a lot of times, we get a response. Sometimes we don't. But who comes to mind for you when you think of, people in your own social world, in your generation? You're like, I would love to check that out.
Right. Well, actually, I have been following American politics, and I feel like even in Vancouver, a lot of people in my generation really, really follows Alexandra Cortez.
Yeah.
AOC. Yes.
Yeah.
Actually, interviewing her would be super, super cool, because I feel like
she's
a lot
totally
of things
badass.
that's been
Yeah, that would be awesome.
really resonates with my generation today, and a lot of things that some of us want, right? But you also have all these lifestyle influencers, but I feel like they need more spotlight, because they are kind of teaching us how to live life through this crisis, through this.
I was going to ask you about this. When you think of the word influencer, the first concepts that come to mind are lifestyle and fashion, and Instagram, because they have cool Instagram posts. So clearly AOC and people who are bringing about political change are literally thinking through how to solve problems, or environmental or economic problems. But talk to me a little bit about the kind of guidance you get from lifestyle influencers on how to live better through this crisis, because that sounds like something along the lines of either life hacking or contemporary philosophy. Unpack that for us.
Right. So I realize that there is an increasing trend right now on social media of influencers encouraging you just to be yourself, because a lot of the times, the capitalism model kind of shaped, what is the life that you should want. And through that, I feel like a lot of people in my generation had a lot of stress just performing day-to-day tasks, or just being authentic for who you are. So right now you see this increasing trend of authenticity. You see this increasing trend of, live as who you are for the world in the future. And I feel like that is a really encouraging trend right now. And it'll be cool to see how these influencers are kind of challenging the social norms on social media, and, seeing these brands all kind of catering towards this authenticity image of everyone. Like, these are really meaningful things, I feel like, for my generation, and how we can be happier as individuals in the future.
And some of this must also be that kind of, I don't know, the frivolity of either consumption or always being out and at an event, at a party, and looking fat. There's something that's a little discordant now, right? I mean, it's like it's a bit of a more serious time, and I think that maybe, yeah. You by the way, you see this profoundly with television advertising, in which the TV ads have now all kind of conformed to this. We celebrate our people and our first responders, and soon it'll get better, but we're working hard together. The music all seems the same. The writing seems the same. Like, people, there is this cultural weird thing that we're aiming at that is a narrower dynamic range of the human experience that I guess influencers, who of course famously help create FOMO culture and everybody's a brand, are now tending towards. That'd be a very interesting thing to look into. Also, it'd be interesting to take the same influencer now and how he or she was a year or two ago, and see how they've all moved and what they said.
Yeah. Well, I also think, if you look at brands, you mentioned brands, Jocelyn, and I remember Dove went out of their way, Dove soap, to try to be more authentic. In other words, they showed real people. They showed real people's bodies. They didn't have like the supermodel that probably weighs 7 pounds and has been starving themselves for the last 4 months so that they look good. And there were some other people that were influencers that were like showing the actual picture they looked like versus the picture that got touched up on Vogue, where it was just like, wow, they have like a teeny face. What happened? But in reality, they didn't. And it feels like, is that what you're talking about? It's people who are sort of like saying, let's be authentic.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And now you see, just for female wise, or the beauty industry wise, you see an increased shades and different shades of foundation, whereas before it was only a few shades. And a lot of the times, if you're Black, you cannot find the shades that's suitable for you. Or even being Asian, I can't find a shade that's tan enough for my skin, because you just lack of diversity in all of these industries. But now you're seeing this increasing trend on catering to everyone else's needs, right? And that's also a really good trend to observe.
So we should probably wrap this up. Last words, Jocelyn or Peter, I don't know. Last words. How would you close this episode? Jocelyn.
I would say through observing all the information in these episodes, I feel like all these innovation topics, definitely a lot of the topics we talked about can help us navigate through how the world is going to look like. How can we kind of adapt to all these new norms for people in my generation? And I feel like, knowing all these technology advancement, all these economical changes, these episodes really did prep us more for the future. And I'm super grateful for this opportunity to put up this little episode.
We're glad you came. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
All right, but you're not done. Now you got to put together the episode with all your guests.
Yeah.
So that's our next challenge for you. You've got a little time,
right?
It's summer, but that would be fun. Anyway, thanks so much for putting this together. That was fun, and it was really nice to kind of revisit things, but look at it from your eyes. I think that was valuable for us.
Here's the thing I've learned from this: quarantine is a verb. It's a verb. That is to say, this is about organizing people for the future and creating that collective response. We had a show on a couple weeks ago. I think it was our World's Fair show. We said what really matters now is how do you take an audience and actually organize people to start becoming part of the solution, whether it's working on urban prototyping in their communities or work using software for digital twins in communities and getting involved in co-creation. But one of the things we learned is from Cathers is citizenship is not passive. It's got to be active. It's got to be involved. And we see this in electoral politics all the time. But if the current generation is the generation that is going to be on top of how a more inclusive economy works, or how it's less extractive, or how we take on the environmental problems, that has to be an active conversation of learning, as we've kind of learned in a lot of these episodes, and as Cathers has done, and then of doing and of setting examples. And Mick, we've said this is kind of a direction for us to go in, but I think it's a direction for social media to go in. People are, with the Facebook, with the boycott Facebook and the hate speech stuff, there's always this question. We've talked about this in a lot of shows. Well, how does social media evolve in a more positive way? And one way would be, well, less hate speech and more nice speech. But it may not just be speech, it may be actions. It's that verb again of how we use these technologies to organize people for change. That's what I took away. But we're going to need people's help in getting there. Mick?
All right, Peter, it's time to call it.
All right, shall we?
I'm good.
It is 5:51 Pacific Quarantine on a Friday afternoon. Thank you, Jocelyn, Mickey, Omid, Mohib, and audience. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Let's get close, but not so close. You can share from a distance for a time. You know we want to see each other. We'll have to stay in your quarantine space while we try.